One of my most anticipated movies of all time finally came out after 8 years of waiting. I was 10 years old when the FNAF movie was first announced in 2015. And since then there's been many different reports of the movie being in production. Then they would say that it was suffering production issues. Then they would go as far along to say that it was never even going to happen at all. But 8 years later in 2023, I'm now 19 years old and the movie is finally here. But the question is, was it worth the 8-year wait? Before I answer that question, I wanted to get into a little background. And I know that this movie came out 2 weeks ago. I just been super busy and sorry I haven't been able to upload. But as most of you know, the response for this movie has not exactly been great. The critics have been going super hard at this movie. The overall consensus of the movie is that the fans love it, while the critics who typically don't understand the source material hate it, which is typically how these video game movies go. We just saw the same thing happen earlier this year with the Mario movie, as it got bad reviews from critics while the fans loved it. But with the Mario movie, people at least had something good to say about it. But with the FNAF movie, it's the complete opposite. People are either calling this movie good or the worst movie that they've ever seen, which I think is a little bit far-fetched. Even though it wasn't the best movie in the world, it was nowhere near the worst, and I'm not just saying that just because I grew up with Five Nights at Freddy's. Just a disclaimer before we start the review, this is a spoiler review, and typically all my movie and TV show reviews are spoiler reviews, but I feel like this one in particular needs to include spoilers because of the controversy with this movie. So without further ado, let's talk about this highly anticipated movie. To answer my previous question of if this movie was worth the 8-year wait, I have to say that it was absolutely worth it. And admittedly, that is a fully biased statement. Five Nights at Freddy is one of my biggest childhood staples, and just the fact that they made this movie happen in the first place is crazy to me since it was something that I thought was never gonna happen. Watching this movie on the big screen in the theater made this a different type of experience as I was able to point out everything. But while I did think that it was worth the wait, that doesn't mean that it didn't have its problems, which is what I want to get into first. Now let's make one thing clear. I like the movie, but I do have a lot to say about it in terms of being a FNAF fan and being a movie fan. First things first, I think the biggest issue with this movie is the pacing. I do feel like it took a little too long to get into the overall premise of Five Nights at Freddy's, which is ultimately the animatronics being alive and trying to kill the security guard. I didn't like how the animatronics weren't really a threat to Mike the security guard until the final act of the movie, which was the 5th night of him working there. I feel like they didn't really emphasize how dangerous the animatronics were until the final night, and the only time they really did that in between the final night and the opening scene was when they had the scene of the goons breaking into the restaurant and all of them got killed by the animatronics. Other than that, there was really no point in the movie other than the final act where the animatronics were threatening Mike's life like they do in the game. That's why I love the opening scene so much, because it was one of the only points in the movie where we see the fear of being a security guard in a place full of animatronics that are trying to kill you, which is ultimately what the game was. Mike doesn't even fully meet them until night 3 when he brings his sister along. I do think that it would have been better if around night 3 Mike sees one of the animatronics moving by itself on the camera and staring at him creepily or something like that, but not necessarily attacking him, which is like what they were doing in the scene where his sister introduces them to him. It would have been more suspenseful, especially since Vanessa had showed him the animatronics doing what they were programmed to do on night 2, and it would have made him more suspicious of them. Instead, when he finds out that they're literal ghost children possessing the animatronics, he doesn't seem to be concerned at all and think that they could be dangerous or anything. I think that they could have did a little better with the pacing and including a bit more of the game aspect to it, as I don't even think Mike looked at the cameras one time in the movie since he was asleep on the job for in the dream plot. Another big issue that I have with the movie is ultimately the elephant in the room, the fort scene during night 4. This was probably the most controversial part in the whole movie, and honestly for good reason. When you grew up with the games and remember that the games revolve around killer animatronics, seeing them build a fort and falling down on the ground like cartoon characters is very disappointing. It can completely take you out the movie, especially when you saw Freddy bite a girl in half literally 20 minutes earlier. Side note, that is another issue with the movie. It can't decide if it wants to be a full-blown horror movie or more of a horror adjacent movie that has a mostly kids and family feel to it with some elements of horror sprinkled into it. It has a full-blown horror scene of people getting killed by animatronics, then a scene of those same animatronics building a fort. Like I said, as a fan of the games, this thing completely takes you out the movie because you grew up watching these animatronics trying to jump scare you and kill you every 10 seconds, and that this scene just feels like it's just out of place. But yet through all of that, I still feel like it's not a terrible scene as both a movie fan and a FNAF fan. I also wasn't a fan of some of the changes that they made as a FNAF fan. I thought that it was stupid that William Afton had control of the animatronics through the pictures on the wall, yet whenever they were in Mike's dreams, they seemed to know that Springtrap was the one that killed them. But in the finale, they don't even try to kill Afton until Abby draws a different picture. Making Vanessa William Afton's daughter could have been a lot more interesting than they executed it as, in my opinion. I would have preferred it if they had made her evil along with her dad, just because it would have been a more interesting plot considering that she isn't really the nicest person in Security Breach, but it was alright in the way that they played it out as. Overall, they made a lot of decisions that didn't really follow the lore of FNAF, and all I could think of in the back of my mind was the game lore, but it didn't bother me too much since the movie was its own independent story and universe. Now I know that all of that made it sound like I absolutely hate this movie, but that is not the case at all. Let's talk about the good. First and foremost, I want to discuss the animatronics. The animatronics were easily the most impressive part of the movie. This movie only had a budget of $20 million, and they made real life animatronics for the movie. They nailed the overall look of the way that the animatronics look in the game, and you could tell that there was not much CGI used at all, which shows the dedication and passion that they had in making the movie. I rewatched the first movie in preparation of this review, but on my first watch in the theater, the way that they would move their heads and just move in general was a bit creepy during certain moments. I also love how the animatronics had all their nice moments throughout the movie, but Chica's Cupcake was just on demon time in the whole movie. The main thing that I really want to discuss, which I thought was the best aspect of the movie story-wise, was the dream plot. Now this plot is ultimately what made up most of the movie, which followed Mike having the same dream every night to try and find out who took his brother as a kid. I thought that this plot was so good that it literally could be a concept for its own movie. It gave me Nightmare on Elm Street vibes since whatever happened to Mike in the dream would happen to him in real life. The concept of the ghost of the kid starting to appear in his dreams was clever since they are ghosts, and it would have made sense for them to be in his dreams when he's at the pizzeria. I thought that it was executed very well toward the final act where all the kids started attacking him in the dream. Then when he woke up, he was about to get sliced up by the Freddy head swirly blade thing. Seriously, what even was that thing? Anyway, the dream plot was one of the main things that carried the overall story of the film, and it was solid for its own independent story. I also thought there were some solid performances in here, but not that much since it was really a small cast, but Josh Hutcherson and Matthew Lillard gave good performances as their respective characters. Matthew Lillard was easily the best performance of the movie, even though he had limited screen time. He played the role well of the suspicious hiring manager in the beginning, and ultimately as William Afton, aka Springtrap, at the end of the film. I also thought that Grant Feely, who played the kid version of Freddy or Golden Freddy, I'm not sure what he played, but he was really good for a kid actor. He was really creepy in a lot of the scenes that he was in. I very much appreciated that they didn't overdo the references to the game in this movie. A lot of times these video game movies get criticism for overdoing the references to the game, but I feel like this movie had the right references for the fans to point out. Although they didn't really stick true to the game for the animatronics' motivation for wanting to kill Mike, I did like how they flipped it and made their motivations to where they wanted his sister, because as a fans of FNAF, we tend to forget that these are kids in these suits, and that they haven't really been around kids their age since, well, they got killed. A very underrated part of the movie that I'm not really seeing people talk about is the soundtrack. The opening credits with the song Five Nights at Freddy by the Newton Brothers playing in the background was generally one of the best opening credit songs I've heard in a movie, and that's not even me being biased. The whole opening credits were amazing with the 8-bit sequence of Springtrap luring the kids. It fits so well with the absolute banger of a song playing in the background. The movie had its bads and its goods, but before I give my rating for the movie, I want to take a second to talk about why I feel like this movie is so controversial between film critics and FNAF fans. But most importantly FNAF fans, since I feel like it's gotten mixed reactions from them based on people's expectations. So the reason why I feel like this movie is so controversial is because of the fact that Five Nights at Freddy's has too much of a complex lore in order to do it justice in one movie. Like I said earlier, the critics went super hard at this movie because they looked at it from a film standpoint and didn't really understand a single thing regarding the actual source material, so certain things are gonna make sense when they don't know anything about the games. When the truth is, this movie was made for the fans and the fans only. It wasn't made to be a cinematic masterpiece. It's obvious with the different references to the games that they had in the movie, the cameos from MatPat and Corey Kenshin. Heck, they even played the FNAF song by the Living Tombstone during the end credits. Corey Kenshin has been my favorite YouTuber since I discovered him 8 years ago, ironically through a Five Nights at Freddy's 1 compilation that he made. It was so crazy seeing him go from talking about the movie like a fan when it was first announced to literally him being in the movie 8 years later. This was made to bring the fans together to go crazy over certain things happening on the screen, which is what many people did in my theater. The MatPat and Corey Kenshin cameos got the best reactions from everybody, along with the other references to the games. This movie was easily the best theater experience I've had since Spider-Man No Way Home. This movie was an event. It was literally made for the fans of the games that had been waiting for the past 7 to 8 years since it was announced. But even with that, many FNAF fans were upset with the movie simply off of the fact that it didn't live up to the expectations that they set. And I think that's what makes it so controversial. Admittedly, I was a bit disappointed once the movie was over because of my personal expectations as a FNAF fan, but I didn't think it was bad at all, and I was able to understand why they did certain things the way that they did, even if I didn't like it. I realized that they made this movie to be its own story and only took certain pieces from the lore of the games. I could definitely assume that the FNAF fans that were mad with the movie were upset that they didn't follow every single piece of the lore and didn't live up to what they were expecting themselves. One of the main complaints I saw from fans was the fact that the movie was PG-13 and not rated R. And I truly don't understand this complaint because while the FNAF games deal with things like kids getting killed and people getting bloodily locked into the suits, the main consumer of Five Nights at Freddy's are children. A lot of people saying that it should be rated R are people like me who were around 8 to 13 years old when the games were coming out, and now that we're older, they want to see a more scary and mature movie. But any person that's not so focused on wanting to see every bit of the lore of the games play out on a screen and are looking at it from a realistic standpoint, realize that they have to make it PG-13 because parents are not going to want to take their children to a rated R movie. It's things like this where people got their expectations too high. It would be stupid to make this movie rated R when the only thing that would make it worthy of even getting an R rating is if they did the spring lock scene like how it is in the game, or if they actually showed the kids getting killed. I also think that FNAF is just one of those things where if you make it into a movie, you're just not gonna please everybody, because like I said earlier, the story of the games are too complex, and realistically, that could be made into a movie based on the lore itself, which is what people were expecting with this movie. Now the last thing I want to talk about is the other reason why I think that FNAF fans were upset with the movie, and that is because of how true to the games the movie was. Now like I said in my bad section of the movie, I feel like they could have used way more elements and aspects of the games, but ultimately I'm not too upset that they didn't, because you can tell that they didn't make this movie just to be a direct copy of the games, which I'm actually grateful for, because it would be boring if the whole movie was just Mike checking the cameras and trying not to get killed like in the game. That ultimately is what FNAF is when you forget about the lore. It was ultimately made to be its own story based off of the games, which is why as a fan I wasn't too mad at the story and the changes that they made. Although when you are a fan, the lore will be in the back of your head whenever anything happens. Whether it's the fact that Mike's brother got taken by William Afton in the movie when that had happened in the game, Vanessa being Afton's daughter, the spring lock scene not being bloody enough, even the fort scene. As much as the fort scene is so out of character for the animatronics, I somewhat appreciate them adding that scene because it reminds people that these are kids in these suits, and you kind of forget that because in the games they just try to kill you. However, this scene obviously upset fans because they just didn't expect it. And even the spring lock scene is causing controversy because it wasn't as bad as it was depicted in the game. I thought it was completely fine considering that I didn't even think we were going to get a spring lock scene to begin with, since it is super bloody and terrifying in the games. But like I said, you aren't going to please everybody because there will always be different expectations. Just to wrap this review up, I feel like the only way you can hate this movie as a fan is if you were expecting a complete lore fest and expecting it to be pinpoint true to the game. It's obvious that Scott Cawthon just wanted to make a movie for the fans to enjoy on the big screen after years of waiting. It wasn't meant to be a movie to pinpoint every single part of the lore, it was to bring all of the fans together. It was a decent video game movie with a solid story, the animatronics and the pizzeria atmosphere were amazing, and it could have been better, but I ultimately was not completely disappointed, and I'm looking forward to what they would do for a sequel. So after all of that, I give the Five Nights at Freddy's movie a 7.5 out of 10.